Some deep assumptions that we have that are really built into how people think about human history ever since agriculture. And one of the things we think about is that agriculture is always better than hunting and gathering, and that you can do more stuff and it's more fun. We've been questioning that a little bit. Ideas about health and being able to be mobile instead of settled. We also examined the organization of social life. If you have a city, does that mean you have to have a ruler? It seems like various cities and societies are able to organize themselves without the kinds of hierarchies that we see emerge later on. We examine the idea that things are always getting more and more complicated. In various ways, evolution doesn't necessarily tend toward complexity. We can simplify things as societies get more complicated. And we looked at this last one a little bit, the idea that there's some law of the jungle, that out there in nature and all the chimpanzees and the other creatures are all competing against each other and fighting it out for the survival of the fittest. And if we don't have a government to tell us what to do, and if we don't have the police around to give me a ticket on a Saturday night, then we'll all just kill each other. It'll be a war of all against all, which is an idea that goes back to the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, but it's been around for a long time. It's just this idea that people, creatures, are naturally violent, naturally going to hurt each other if we don't keep them in line forcefully. So, today's class is really going to examine that last assumption because we see that this does not turn out to be the case. That is perhaps the whole point of chapter 10. In order to do that, though, we have to define our terms a little bit better than they are sometimes defined. A lot of times we hear words like aggression, violence, and warfare, and we think they all mean the same thing, that people are aggressive, they'll be violent, and then they're fighting each other. But there's a difference, or we can define these terms differently. So aggression is a behavior that is motivated by desire to harm, but it doesn't necessarily result in harm. So you could act aggressively or passive aggressive without hurting someone physically or just being mean or intend to be mean. And then we have violence, which is when you take it up to the level where you are hurting someone in some way. But that's interpersonal violence, that's between people. We define warfare as organized violence. So that's when people group together and will fight it out, but it's not an it is between people, but it's between groups, and it must be in some ways organized together. Human beings are the only species who do these things for reasons other than access to resources or access to mates, or what we know of as ideological or symbolic reasons. That is to say, we fight over things like flags and lines on a map and the idea of honor. These things, as far as we know, in the rest of the animal kingdom, people don't really get into conflicts about what color your hats are. They do things over specific resources, and we certainly do that as human beings. We fight over resources sometimes, but we also fight for reasons that we don't really know what they are. Like we fight for our country, which that's an idea that we have in our head, and we fight with people we don't even know over ideas or symbolism. When we turn to other primates, the primates of chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, you do see displays of aggression, so threats that are made, and you do see some interpersonal violence among other primates, but honestly, not a ton. And what we almost never observe, or has never been observed among other primates, is something that we would call warfare or coalitionary aggression, where there's a group that gets together and fights another group. The only primates that have been observed to do coalitionary aggression are chimpanzees. So chimpanzees have been observed to group up and either raid another group or gang up and beat up another chimpanzee individual. I put in parentheses there that this has not been observed among bonobos. And if we think back to our evolution of humans slides and textbook, you will remember that bonobos are equally distant, evolutionarily speaking, from human beings. So we have not observed this among our closest, our equidistant relatives. We have observed it among the chimpanzees. When we have observed it, it seems to be focused on concrete things like food, like mates, or defending a territory. We have observed chimpanzees doing this in a coalitionary way to fight each other. The most observed case of this was done through Jane Goodall and her research assistants in Tanzania. And this is a very famous place. It's really the origin of what we call naturalistic primate studies. Jane Goodall is super famous. She just recently passed away. I'm not going to say anything bad about Jane Goodall, but I will say that when this coalitionary aggression was observed at Gombe in Tanzania, it was a place in which the chimpanzees had been habituated to human presence. They had been given food by the researchers. They had been given stuff. And I watched a movie of one of them that was rolling a gasoline can down a hill to make a lot of noise, and by that, doing that, had ascended to the top of the chimpanzee hierarchy. Now, obviously, in nature, there are no such thing as gasoline cans that you can roll down a hill. In some ways, these groups had been altered by the presence of human beings. I will also say that oftentimes when we observe this coalitionary aggression, it's among groups where their habitat has been reduced by the encroachment of human beings. They might be fighting over habitat, but it might not have been the case, evolutionarily speaking, that they would have had to fight over habitat. So I say that because we do not observe coalition aggression among other primates, except among the chimpanzees, and even in that case, it's unclear if that was a completely natural occurrence. So, what do we see among human beings? We do not see much archaeological evidence for interpersonal violence. We do identify it, and it's been identified 800,000 years ago. We have evidence that there were people that fought each other, stuck those stone tools or knives into each other. Isolated violence has been identified at 800,000 years ago. But crucially, there is no archaeological evidence for coalitionary aggression or warfare before 13,000 years ago. So for most of our evolutionary history, for almost all of it, for those 2 million years or so of being bipedal, securely bipedal, stone-using creatures, and certainly for 200,000 years of being Homo sapiens, there's not archaeological evidence for warfare. And the key to this is that we do see archaeological evidence at about 13,000 years ago. So we may find it earlier. Absence of evidence does not necessarily mean that we did not fight each other in an organized way. But at least from what the archaeologists have been able to uncover, there is clear evidence of warfare emerging about 13,000 years ago, and not evidence of it before that. And then we have an increase in the warfare evidence, stuff like mass graves and weapons and things where it looks like there were battles at about 7,000 years ago. Now, what happens around 13,000 years ago and then intensifies about 7,000 years ago? What might this correspond to? Agriculture, yay, thank you. That we see around 13,000 years ago, the domestication of plants and animals developing into more full-blown agriculture. What do you get when you have agriculture and then start organizing people into these agglomerations of city-states? You get more emphasis on private property, more emphasis on resources to defend, more hierarchy in a society, more people to lead around into war and battle. So again, I'm not saying that this is inevitable. There are plenty of places where they grew things and didn't fight each other that much, but it certainly seems that there's a connection between the emergence of agriculture and being able to organize yourselves, a complex society, in ways that you can boss people around and make them do things, even if it hurts them and hurts other people. So, human beings are an intensely cooperative species. Other primates are also cooperative, and other animals are also cooperative, but we cooperate a lot together, and we form these complex social groups that we've been talking about. We start to organize ourselves by kin, by different forms of ethnic groups, eventually nations. And for the most part, most people like to get along together. There's always some people that don't like to get along, but we do things to them, we shun them, or we gossip about them, and we make people follow the rules. So for most people, we just like to fit in. We like to live harmoniously with our group. We don't like to be teased and left out. We want to follow the norms. Now, usually this is good because we are able to cooperate and do good things together. But sometimes this can also lead to warfare because people get convinced that another group is bad or another group is taking their stuff. Because we are cooperative, we can also cooperate to do bad things to other people. So this is how humans start to fight about things that might be more symbolic or are different than what other creatures fight about. Crucially, though, again, I'm trying to emphasize that this is not built into human nature. And we see an example in the textbook of the Warani, who had for a long time a pretty established norm of intergroup raiding and quite high rates of interpersonal violence. However, they shifted over time so that they became a more peaceful society. Started channeling that energy into political issues rather than interpersonal ones. And so as your textbook notes, that the norms around violence can change. People can become more peaceful and then more violent over time. And so I again want to dispute the idea that this is simply an inbuilt thing, that we're always fighting each other and that's built into human nature. Your textbook talks about the motivations of warfare. And I would say that one of the things that you always have to look out for is how we talk about other people. So there are various rhetorical strategies, things that people use to talk on the radio or on television or in speeches in order to motivate people to do things. And sometimes that rhetoric can be dehumanizing in the sense that you're talking about another person in the world, but you're using language which makes it seem that they are less of a person. You always have to watch out when people are using metaphors. If you hear a person compare another person to some animal like a rat or a savage or a snake, you just have to think to yourself, wait a second, what's going on here? Why am I being asked to compare another human being to some form of animal? Because pretty soon you're probably going to be asked to do something about that. So be careful whenever someone is using rhetoric which compares people to animals. Because what happens is there's people who are interested in fomenting this group identity, which again, in most cases, it's fine to have a group identity. It's good. People cooperate with each other and do nice things, build things, grow things. But if you combine that group identity with this idea that somebody else is threatening you, that they're here to take something away, they're here to hurt you, then you can gin up, or you can increase this idea that those people need to be hurt or eliminated. They aren't even really people. They're not as good as us. So you always have to watch out for this, and you can see these kinds of rhetorical devices if you look at most cases of warfare in human history. There's been some form of dehumanization, an idea that you have to follow orders in order to hurt somebody else because that person is bad. Most of the time, warfare has been conducted, and violence in general, by men. And we see this among primates as well. It's usually the male chimps that are getting together. Not all the time, even human beings, not all the time, but a lot. For human men, this can also be a way of getting an identity, of gaining social status, of thinking that you are bigger and stronger. Or the ideologies or the ideas of being in a military and an organized group can be very appealing. And again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, except when we use it to be mean to other people. I would say that what's interesting here is that even men need to be very trained in order to carry out these activities. It is not something that people just do naturally and they're happy about it. They have to go through basic training, which is a very intense period in which you have your identity broken down and stripped away in some ways, and then you build yourself, you're built back up as a soldier. And this is an intense period of people's lives, and a lot of men don't make it through this. A lot of people don't make it through this because it's a very special form of training. Once again, what I want to emphasize here is this doesn't seem to be something that we just do innately. Even for men, to get them to do these things, to go to war, to commit acts, this is something that requires intense training. And many people, when they return from war and end up suffering some form of psychological distress over time, even if they haven't been injured physically, it can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, even among people who are in these situations. Your textbook also talks about the idea of structural violence. Now, structural violence is an interesting idea which has been introduced to us. It's most famously associated with the anthropologist Paul Farmer, who introduced the idea to anthropology and is used in other disciplines as well. The idea of structural violence comes from the fact that we usually think about violence as being a physical form of aggression, somebody doing something bad to someone else physically. Structural violence points toward a different kind of violence which results from the way society is structured. Because we have complex societies where certain people are on top and certain people are on the bottom, that can result in different amounts of power that people have. Let us say that you live in a society in which you are in a poorer strata. You have less access to healthcare, less access to education, less access to food, water. that can mean that you contract illnesses more rapidly. You don't have access to health care. Your group has higher rates of death. That, in this idea of structural violence, is a form of violence. It's not somebody putting a gun to your head and saying to do something, or it's not a physical aggression, but it is a social form of aggression in which some groups have better outcomes, better health outcomes than other groups. This might help if we get a more particular example. Your textbook uses the example of settler colonialism when groups, primarily from Europe, came to the Americas and took over certain parts of land. They use the example of what happened in the United States and Canada in the 19th and 20th centuries. Children were removed from their indigenous groups and put into boarding schools. Now, a lot of people had perhaps they wanted to help people, or so they said. But what happened to the people who were removed from their homes is they prohibited them from speaking their indigenous language. There was a lot of language death during that period, and that before the Europeans arrived in the Americas, there were thousands of indigenous languages being spoken in what is now the United States and Canada, and most of those languages have died. And the removal of children into boarding schools and the forcing of that was part of that process. What happens is that because of this trauma and the fact that this continues to this day, that indigenous peoples or Native Americans are often subjected to differential rates of treatment, have less access to healthcare, education, and wealth in general than other groups, is that it creates a situation in which we might call this a form of structural violence. So in certain cases, there was actual violence in warfare, but there was also this situation set up in which people were subjected to the rule of others, and the result was and is differential rates of disease, illness, death, and less health. So once again, I just want to emphasize that these things happen in human societies, violence, warfare, but they are not built into them. They are not necessarily going to happen all the time. They are something that comes and goes, and we can change, and we can set up our society differently. In the next section, your textbook discusses forms of fighting back. What people do when they feel like they are in a situation of structural violence or actual violence, that their group is being disadvantaged in relationship to the rest of society. And it mentions 4 forms in which people fight back. Like other ideas, these are not necessarily all neatly separated, but there are different ways in which we talk about how people try to change their circumstances. Resistance, revolution, reconciliation, and refusal, 4 R words. These are not necessarily completely separate, just ways that we talk about it. Resistance does not have to be bloodshed. Resistance you can use petitions, you can have boycotts, you can go on strike. So there are public forms of resistance, which you can try to do things that way, or you can do hidden or slower forms of resistance. So if somebody is exacting too much out of your job, you just slow down your work, or you leave your job. Maybe you don't tell it. It can be when people take over places or poach resources, that maybe the state or the billionaires are trying to take over everything, and this is a way of fighting back. Your textbook mentions the idea of language revitalization. So although many indigenous languages have been eliminated, there has also been an effort to recuperate those languages, to start teaching them again. And that is a form of resisting what has been imposed upon other people. It can be relatively individual, but it can also be public and organized, and it can be used to challenge power. This is how many of the civil rights reforms were brought about by boycotting or by going on strike and getting things that way without necessarily bloodshed. So, revolution. Nobody chose revolution. A revolution is when there's a challenge to the government, the state, with the goal of establishing a new government. Now, apparently in this country, we love the American Revolution, but then we should never do it again. That's what they teach us. Good job, George Washington. Now stop.
Well, they made it illegal.
Well, revolutions are usually illegal because they're trying to replace the government with a new government. That's the whole point. That's funny. Last year, when I taught this class, the majority of people were into revolution. And I don't know what happened. Now we're all like chilling and like, no. But we're tired. We got tired. Yeah, last year people were fired up. They were like, yeah, we need a revolution. This year, obviously, no. Yeah, even though I'm like too tired for revolution. Now, if what we saw on January 6th when those people stormed into the Capitol and stopped the vote counting for a while, and we saw those scenes on TV, if that is a form of resistance or revolution. Now, let me ask you this. We are talking about ways in which the little people, the people on the bottom who are getting disadvantaged, are trying to fight back or change the system. For example, in the American Revolution, you had people who were being dominated by one group of people and got pissed off about that. Taxation without representation, not having your own form of government. You have a revolution. What do you call it? Because let us remember, when those people marched in on January 6th, they were trying to stop people from counting votes, and they were trying to keep the person who was in power, even though he was supposed to leave power. What do you call it when a small group of people tries to continue their dominance by overthrowing a democratically elected government? There's another word for that. What do you call it when one person uses the military or other form of violent occupation to continue dominance or to throw out a democracy? You call it a coup. Yeah, it's when one person uses the military or some form of violent organization to establish dominance against a democracy. We didn't have a civil war. We were watching a bunch of people do this in Washington. It was not a civil war. It was an attempted coup. That's what it was. And yes, usually in an attempted coup, people are supposed to go to jail. Reconciliation. Many of you loved reconciliation. I had my largest group of reconciliation people. I do love reconciliation, true, when it works. But when does reconciliation work? According to your textbooks, it works when you can expose the truth of what's been going on. So you're not trying to cover up the truth. That's something else. When you just pardon a bunch of people and say, that was cool, that's not reconciliation because you aren't exposing the truth, you're hiding the truth. So first you want to expose the truth and you want to establish responsibility. Hey, who did what here? And the purpose of this is so that you don't have to keep hurting each other. You can then move on forward in peace. So, for example, in the case of some of these boarding schools, there have been efforts to expose the truth of what happened in those schools. And in some of them, there was actual violence against indigenous children to establish responsibility for who did that in order to come to a better place in which we can say that was wrong. And we're now going to try to be better and move forward in peace. So Joe Biden was the first US president to go to a Native American reservation, I think it was in Arizona, and apologize for the policy of removing children to boarding schools. The US government had not ever said that that was wrong. This might be seen as a way of trying to reconcile, to account for past injustices, to establish responsibility and move forward in peace. I like this too, if it works. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Refusal. There's not, the line between resistance and refusal is sometimes it's hard to say exactly where one might draw that line. But by refusal, we mean that if you are not going to adhere or comply with unjust laws or norms. So I mentioned that the civil rights, for example, was in some ways a form of resistance, but you might also consider it to be a form of refusal. You are told that you must sit in the back of the bus and you refuse to sit in the back of the bus because you believe that is an unjust law. That is a form of refusal to adhere to unjust laws or norms. In some cases, it might mean that you reject the idea that a certain country has power over you. In the case of some indigenous groups, it means that you do not acknowledge that the colonial power should have control over your actions. And in some cases, this means that you resist the idea that you should belong to a nation state or have citizenship in a nation state or are a member of an ethnic identity. Your textbook gives you the example of the work of Audra Simpson, who was working in a place not too far from here along the Mohawk that span the territory of the United States and Canada. Their indigenous territory is now cut through by a national border. Now, by treaty rights, they have the right to cross that border without a passport and should be able to cross between those two places. However, that right is often challenged or interrupted. What Simpson was working on is that there are certain people who are trying to refuse to pay allegiance to either one of these national governments. So this is it's an interesting form of resistance, and I would say, don't quote me on this, but I agree with the refusal people. Maybe we need more of that in our society, a little more refusal here.